This movie is a ride, and for the most part, a very enjoyable one. I've seen this movie multiple times since it released, and it is still as emotionally impactful as it was upon first viewing. Now, I haven't seen this movie in a few years, and I gotta say, I kinda have a big problem with the third act. I think this movie serves as a fantastic bookend to the Infinity Saga. Like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. And if you're new, check out the channel and let me know what you think. Let's dive into Avengers Endgame. I remember sitting in the theater opening night for this movie, just anxiously waiting for that Marvel logo to roll across the screen. I was so excited yet nervous all at the same time, and 3 hours later, I couldn't believe what I just watched. I wanted to immediately watch it again. I gasped, I laughed, I sobbed. It was an emotional roller coaster. Almost all of my favorite characters in this franchise packaged into one epic conclusion to this chapter. And it is epic. Now, I have one big negative of this film. I'll save that for the end because all I want to do right now is just gush over every aspect of this film that I love. Let's start with the story. Look, I know that this narrative requires knowledge of the past events in this franchise, especially of the previous film, but I do not care. I love the way that the plot of this movie unfolds. Marcus and McFeely did a great job of bringing Clint and Scott back into the mix. Both instances make sense in the context of their previous storylines, and both have such an emotional weight to them. Clint losing his entire family, not having any idea about what is happening to the world. He goes on a killing spree across the globe to channel that anger. Scott escaping the quantum realm to realize hope was snapped out of existence and finding Cassie, now a teenager, and just being so distraught over the time he's missed with her was incredible. Utilizing the ending of Scott's story and his knowledge of the quantum realm and its time dilation factor, and then integrating that as the main driver of this narrative was an awesome idea. For one, it opens up the idea of time travel and the multiverse into this universe, and secondly, it elevates Scott from just a side character to one of the big players in this movie. It promotes him to an actual Avenger. He's finally really in the big leagues, as he's really the only hero that understands what the team is getting themselves into. As I said in my Infinity War retrospective, I love the idea of the team being split up and fighting on multiple fronts. They bring this aspect back for Endgame, only this time it's one giant heist at different moments in time. You got Cap, Tony, Scott, and Bruce going back to New York in 2012 to retrieve the Mind, Time, and Space Stones. Thor and Rocket back to Asgard when Malekith attacks for the Reality Stone. Rhodey and Nebula intercepting Quill to get the Power Stone on Morag, and Natasha and Clint have to deliberate over a sacrifice for the Soul Stone. This is great. I love not only returning to some of these big moments from this franchise, but I also love seeing how these characters interact with their environment and their past selves. We get so many wild moments, so many emotional moments, and so many of these moments I never saw coming, but the thing is, they still hit me as hard as they did that first time. I want to discuss some of my favorite character moments. I know there are a lot of them because this film, like Infinity War, every character gets a big moment to shine, for the most part. Let's start with Cap. Cap deceiving Hydra agents to steal the Mind Stone is hilarious. Having him confront himself back when he was so earnest and just such a Boy Scout, even to the point where he's rolling his eyes over his former self about how serious he used to be. It was a great touch to this character's storyline in this film. Then Mjolnir. Insane. I couldn't believe it, I still can't believe it now. It gives me chills every time. He was wrecking Thanos too, facing off against him with the shield and the hammer. And in the way the Russos and the writers dreamed up a perfect way to bring his story full circle and give him a phenomenal send-off, that final scene when he finally gets to dance with Peggy, it gets me teary-eyed every time. What a way to end not only a movie, but his character's ridiculous journey. Speaking of getting emotional, I still can't believe they killed Natasha. I understand going into this movie that people were going to die. This was especially true for the OG cast who had been doing this for so long at this point. Which is understandable because they're getting older, they want to do other projects, and we needed to add some stakes to this universe. There's not a lot of people that have died in this franchise, at least on the side of the heroes. When her and Clint arrive on Vormir, I totally forgot what this whole trial entailed. I didn't want either of these characters to go, and as heartbreaking as Natasha's death was, it was so noble and it made complete sense within the context of this story and her story. Clint has a life outside of the Avengers, a wife, kids, a home. Natasha doesn't. Her life is her work, protecting the world. Her family is her team, the rest of the Avengers. For her character, her ultimate purpose was to give her life to save the universe, and she did that. It was devastating to watch play out on screen, especially knowing that Clint had to be the one to let it happen, but it was so important to this story and the franchise going forward. Let's talk about Thor and Hulk. A lot of people had issues with their characters. I'm not one of them. Thor is a broken man at this point. I like how the notion that he has failed affected him so greatly. He's taken so much of the blame for what happened, and he's become so mentally unstable. Out of shape, he's relying on substances to preoccupy his mind. That's a good idea. It worked so well with Tony in Iron Man 3. Now, I will agree that Thor's plight being played for jokes in this film is perplexing. Especially to how seriously, for the most part, Tony's anxiety and depression was handled in Iron Man 3. The two just don't go hand in hand. That's where it loses me. But I like the general idea of having Thor suffer this setback. I also think there just wasn't enough time in this crowded affair to explore this in the manner that it deserved to be. But that still doesn't negate the fact that the writers sort of fumbled this character's arc. But I like it nonetheless. Then there's Professor Hulk. Would it have been cool to see Bruce go through this transformation? Absolutely. Does it matter that much to get to see this? Not really. I like the aspect of seeing a different version of the Hulk. I saw a lot of people, especially right when this movie came out, getting so upset because we didn't get the massive bulldozer Hulk just smashing shit. But the thing is we've already seen that in 4 separate films in this universe. I like this because it's different. It takes this character in a different direction. And the effects for it are very, very good. It's a nice change of pace for Bruce's characterization, and he finally seems to have control over his life, which was his end goal this entire time. Tony meeting Howard in the past and bonding over their roles as fathers and their deep love for their children hits so hard. Even harder now that I have my own child. Also, Tony has a daughter. Incredible. Their relationship is adorable. The way they banter back and forth with each other. The I love you 3000 was such a good touch. This movie gives Tony so much good development and so much closure. He gets to save Peter, save the world, bring everyone back, and ultimately he's the one to defeat Thanos with his own sacrifice. And my God, what a rough moment that is. Every time, still. It's the only time I've seen my wife cry during a movie, quite honestly. We've just spent so much time with these characters, and I'm happy we had loss, because as I said, this franchise needed more stakes. But when Tony is lying there just ripped to shreds. It is devastating. But it was such an incredible conclusion to his journey. And how about Thanos? Leading up to this movie, I remember there were so many rumors going around that Thanos would be in it, but he wasn't going to be a big, important part. Certainly not the main villain. Maybe there would be another villain that would pop up that would mean more to the narrative in this story. Or maybe there was going to be like a Thanos and a co-villain, etc. Then, when Thor decapitates him in like the first 20 minutes, I was like, well, shit, where the hell do we go from here? But I thought the way they brought him back was so creative. Integrating Nebula's cyborg attributes into the narrative was a welcome surprise. It brings Thanos back into this conflict seamlessly. And man, I didn't think he could get any more imposing. I mean, he takes on Cap, Tony, and Thor all at one time and barely breaks a sweat. Honestly, the only person that gives him any real issues is Wanda. Every piece of dialogue he espouses in Endgame is perfection. You can tell that Brolin had a blast with this role. He really is probably the best villain in this franchise. Now, all of that being said, I don't care for the final battle. I know people love it. I loved it the first time too, but every time I rewatch this movie, I like it even less. Look, there are incredible moments for sure. That cannot be denied. Tony and Pepper teaming up, Wanda trashing Thanos, Cap and Mjolnir, the Avengers assemble. I mean, there's a ton of those. These small, ridiculous, insanely cool moments. The list goes on. But my issue is that it's sort of so just incoherent and nonsensical for the majority of it. I'm never really a fan of just two big armies crashing into each other because you can't really ever just focus on what's actually going on. Not to mention that this whole section is plastered against this horrible, gray, desolate, charred environment. It looks terrible in a lot of the shots. The more I go over this segment, the more stuff just doesn't make sense to me. Like, presumably Tony is on the complete opposite side of the battlefield from Strange, but somehow sees him hold up the number 1 with his hand. Thanos firebombs the entire place, but we keep cutting to scenes of people just talking or hugging, etc. Even though there's just massive explosions happening everywhere around them. It always is filmed and seems like all the heroes are kind of separated on different sides of this battlefield, fighting in different fights, but then they just kind of appear next to each other when the plot needs them to. It's very strange. Also, everyone is communicating via earpieces, but people get earpieces in the first place. There's just a ton that takes me out of this now that I'm past, like, the initial wow factor. Also, a dumb way to sideline Doctor Strange. Like, water's collapsing in, I get it. He uses a spell to, like, vortex it up so it doesn't crush everybody. But, like, he's gotta have a spell that just keeps it there by itself without him actually having to, like, stand there, right? I mean, like, he was the Sorcerer Supreme. It's just kind of ridiculous that he can't just, like, have an auto spell keeping that thing going. You know what I mean? It's just silly things like that. I don't know. It takes me out of this whole battle. I'm not the biggest fan of it anymore, despite how many cool moments there are in it. And I also have a problem with the Black Order. They didn't do a ton in the first movie, I get that. They were at least formidable. This movie, they literally all get taken out in like seconds. Like Falcon takes out the giant one. It doesn't make any sense. They just get decimated like they're not these fantastic warriors that like Thanos has at his side. This movie, it just gets ridiculous in this third act sometimes. I understand why people are awestruck by it. That was definitely me the first few times I watched it. It's just the more I analyze this, the more I see it, the more I realize it isn't as great as I thought it was, and the execution definitely leaves a lot to be desired. And for me, it is the weakest aspect of this movie. Endgame is overall an amazing conclusion to this stage in this franchise. Given what was set up in Infinity War, I don't know if the Russos and the writers could have pulled off anything more satisfactory. This was hands down one of the most fun theater experiences that I've ever had. I will never forget it. And even though over time I've started to take some issues with the third act, I still absolutely love this movie nonetheless. It will always be one of my favorite films in this franchise. Because the thing that makes this movie so good is seeing the conclusion to some of our favorite characters' journeys. Tony and Cap get fantastic send-offs, as well as Natasha. I know to a lot of people this movie seems more like a theme park ride than an actual piece of artistic cinema, and I get that. I understand. But to me, the way these characters in this franchise up to this point have been treated and the way that they are able to include those characters' stories is beautiful. And in my mind, Avengers Endgame will always be considered one of the most beautiful pieces of cinema I've ever seen.